Oh, okay. Hello again, Internet. Apparently we are connected again. So, hope you're doing well. In this little short video, relatively. Not a short, but a short video. I wanted to talk to you about the what if that I had proposed at the outset of the war between Israel and Hamas that started on October 7th. And that what if was, if you are somebody who wants there to be peace in the Middle East, if you're somebody who wants to see an end to bloodshed and an end to the war, and all innocent hostages, period, being released, well then there's one easy way for that to happen. And I suggested that Hamas surrenders to Israel and release all the hostages and begin to educate its people not to hate Israel. Well, we're already starting to see the first of those three things happening. Right? I posted that first video about it, wrote a bunch of things about it online. Since then, we've seen a manner of people from, well-known talking heads to politicians to average Joes commenting all over the place that what should happen is that Hamas should surrender. And we've seen in recent days a number of people who are Hamas fighters surrendering to the IDF. And people who are, of course, as always, haters of the Jews are saying, oh, they're dehumanizing them by making them strip down to their skivvies. Why do they keep them like that? Why don't they let them, surrender with clothes on? Well, if you've never faced somebody in a group like Hamas, then you would have maybe no idea that they wear bomb belts and do other tricks to try to attack soldiers that are accepting their surrender, right, while they're surrendering. So they could be wearing an IED, they could have, weapons hidden, whatever it is, knives, guns, clubs, do anything to try to actually attack the soldiers that they're supposedly surrendering to. And as a security measure, Israel makes them, just take off their clothes down to their underwear, but lets them keep on their underwear, right? Lets them keep on their decency, if you will, their dignity, and processes them. So during the first part of the process, they're just held in that condition. And they say, well, after they check them, why don't they let them put the clothes back on? Because when you're accepting dozens or hundreds of these people at a time, you can't just sit them all down in rows of 5, or rows of 4, or whatever it is, in groups of 100 or 200 or even 50, and just let them all put their clothes back on, because there could be somebody walking by, slipping something to somebody, they could put it under their shirt, and then proceed attacking. So you make them sit like that. And sorry, left-wing liberals like Cenk Uygur, if that offends your sensibilities, but that is not dehumanizing. That is protecting lives of the soldiers who are capturing them. And also, by the way, of the other Hamas fighters who you might say, well, they don't care about their own lives. Well, okay, if that's your belief, then I don't see why you're crying about the fact that they're being annihilated by the IDF if they don't care about their own lives. So making them take off their own clothes and staying only in their underwear is perfectly legitimate as an act of war, as an action of war, as a tactic by a force that's removing surrendering soldiers. It's a very accepted part of the process. The U.S. Army does this, the Israelis do this, many armies do this when they're faced against groups like terrorist organizations that, again, do not follow any of the rules of war. They do not observe or respect the Geneva Conventions at all, and they make illegal actions in war constantly. Right? They target illegally. They attack illegally. They put civilians in harm's way on purpose, which is a war crime. Right? Everything that they're doing when it comes to their acts of war are literal war crimes. And it's not because they're a small group. It's not because they don't have an officially recognized state. It's not because they're labeled as a terrorist organization. They're labeled as a terrorist organization because they don't observe the rules of war, because they target innocent civilians, because their entire intention and motivation is to cause terror in the hearts and minds of their enemies, and also, by the way, in the hearts and minds of the people that they repress, that they control, and that they 100% do not care about. Right? If Hamas at all cared about the Palestinians, they would have surrendered by now. Why do I say this? Well, because if they cared about the civilians and if they'd surrendered, that this nonsense would end. Right? We all know that. That's a fact. You can't. There's no duality about that. Right? There would be a possibility, and it would be a high probability, that if the Hamas surrenders, that there would be peace even between Israel and Gaza. Of course, Hamas cannot stay in charge, just like the Nazis could not stay in charge after World War II. And the imperial forces of Japan could not stay in charge of Japan after World War II. They had to change their ways. They had to denazify in Germany. They had to de-emperor in Japan. And only then could they start to re-educate and reintegrate into the global community, which, by the way, both of those countries did extremely well. And within far less than a generation, they were welcomed back. It took, in fact, just a couple of years at that for them to really, go full-throated and full-powered into revamping their cultures and their communities and their countries and their nations and their states to rejoin the decent community of nations, right? And the world was able to let those countries rejoin the communities of the globe economically, politically, and in fact in every single way. And those two nations became two of the leading economies very quickly thereafter. Now, why is that any different for the Hamas and the Palestinians? The answer is ideology and boastfulness as a culture, and the inability to admit defeat, even though it's in their best interest to do so. Right? Because a short-term defeat, like losing this war, which they're doing anyway, and we're seeing Hamas soldiers or Hamas fighters surrender anyway, right, is ultimately good for the Palestinians, the average Palestinian in Gaza, even though they may openly support Hamas on what they did on October 7th, and they may openly support the ongoing actions of Hamas against Israel, and they may openly blame Israel for Israel's retaliation, which, by the way, is perfectly legal under the rules of war. And there is no such thing as proportionality in warfare. That is a joke. And just people who are saying, 1% of Gaza's population has died. First of all, you're accepting Hamas numbers, which is clearly a wrong thing to do, because they clearly lie about their numbers. And people are saying, there's more than 20,000 dead civilians. No, it's definitely not more than 20,000 dead civilians. And by the way, even if it is, every single drop of blood that has been spilt in Gaza since October 7th is clearly on Hamas's hands. Because if they had not triggered the attacks of October 7th, there would be no war. If they had not taken hostages into Gaza, there would be no war. If they had not maintained a war posture against Israel since October 7th and fired another 10,000 rounds of rockets against Israel, randomly targeting nobody, but just shooting at civilians and trying to kill as many innocent people as they could, there would be no war. But they're doing all those things and far, far more. If they had not attacked all the Israeli soldiers that came into Gaza, there'd be no war, right? And if they just surrendered, there'd be no war. But they didn't do that, right? They want to be in it for the long haul because of ideology and because of boastfulness, and also because of greed. Wait, what? Yes. Well, in case you didn't know, the Hamas shorted a bunch of Israeli stocks, index funds, etc., on the Israeli stock market on the eve of the war. And the only significant orders on the market for those particular ETFs or index funds on the eve of the war were orders placed to short that were controlled by Hamas and their financial patrons, which means that when the war launched, Hamas benefited financially by shorting these Israeli stocks, and which is why we saw things like the Israeli shekel fall in value from about 3.6 shekels to the dollar to a little bit over 4 shekels to the dollar, and it got up to about as high as 4.2 or something like that shekels to the dollar a couple of weeks after the war began, and then it began to come back down to normal levels, and it's back to around 3.6, 3.7 shekels to the dollar now. But in the meantime, the big money that controls the Hamas, notably their leaders in Qatar and the Qatari government and other people that support them, took huge profits from the beginning of this war by shorting Israeli stocks, because they knew that the initial panic reaction would be to short Israeli stocks. And so you see that this was just another way for them to rake in billions of dollars against their enemy by literally short selling Israeli stocks as a temporary measure to beef up their finances and continue their repressive ways in Gaza and their terrorist ways in Gaza and against Israel. So there are a lot of reasons why Hamas is guilty of war crimes, and there is a lot of evidence that they did it for the money, as well as for ideology and boastfulness and their inability to admit defeat, which is just pathetic, and it exemplifies so much about why we do not, in my opinion, we do not need to accept anything less on the side of Israel than the absolute unconditional surrender of the Hamas and the release of the hostages and the re-education of their people. Now, you may say to me, well, that's biased, and that's, in your post-liberal worldview, you might tell me, oh, you can't do that, that's not right. They have the right to determine for themselves how they want to educate themselves. Really? Because that's not how war goes, right? War is that the victor, has the upper hand when it comes to the negotiation of the peace. Right? The victor doesn't have to give in to every demand of the loser. Right? That's not how that goes. If that were the case, then Israel, would not exist, right? Because every single war Israel has faced in the last 75 years, by being attacked by Arab armies or terrorist armies, Israel has won all those wars, one way or another, quickly or not, and has not, submitted to all of the demands of their enemies. Have they been allowed technically to win? Actually declare a real victory? No, of course not, because the political forces that will not let them do that, because they don't want that, right? They're looking for mealy-mouthed ceasefires and nonsense that will basically let the conflict continue for decades or centuries, because of interests, right? Military interests, defense interests, political interests, or ideological interests. Protesters who hate Israel, who just want to, see the destruction of Israel, no matter what, because they're insane, and they think that Israel is the root of all evil and all this other, Jew-hating propaganda. And that's what we're dealing with on the side of Israel up against the side of the Palestinians that support Hamas. So it is patently absurd to think that Israel should be forced to accept anything less than unconditional surrender by as well as the full release, immediate release of the hostages, and the re-education of their people. That's just how that goes. If they refuse to do that, this war will not end. Not for days, weeks, months, years, decades, or centuries. It will just keep going on, because if you have a population that is constantly educated to hate, you're going to get, right? It happens. We see it all the time. If you turn their ways from hate to love, or at least to live and let live, then you can have real peace. Anyway, that's that for now. Have a good one. See ya.